Hi guys, it's Sean here. I'm your account manager here for Telefonica here at SmartBear. I guess following a recent survey, we know that a lot of people are using SoapUI Pro for functional testing over there. So today we just wanted to do a quick high-level zip through the latest offerings around SoapUI Pro, and also just take a look around other areas where you might be able to utilize the Ready API platform for your API testing needs. So with that, back over to Ronan. I guess what we really want to establish here is any questions you guys have for us. Please use this time to speak up and ask us whatever might be kind of poignant over the next 30 minutes. So over to you, Ronan.
Perfect. I just want to confirm everyone can see the screen. And yes, thank you. Thanks for confirming that. So my name is Ronan Trainer. I'm a technical sales engineer with SmartBear Software. I'm based out of our European headquarters here in Ireland. So thanks for joining today's webinar, which is specific to Telefonica customers and staff. So before we have a quick look through the tool and what's new in version 2.4, just wanted to talk a little bit about SmartBear if you didn't know it or weren't aware of the company itself. So we have our headquarters in Boston, and we've now 9 offices worldwide. So we recently opened up an office in Melbourne to cater for our APAC customers. We are known as an open source innovator. So if you've heard of Swagger or SoapUI, then that's SmartBear. As you can see on the bottom of the screen here, I suppose most well-known of our tools would be Test Complete, SoapUI, Swagger Hub, a new addition like cross-browser testing, and then for test management, QA Complete, and then Alert Site when it comes to synthetic monitoring of your applications and APIs. Okay, so just wanted to touch on our portfolio a little bit more. So you can see up here at the UI layer, sorry, 1 second. My PowerPoint's having a mind of its own. So you can see at the UI layer from a development, testing, and operations perspective, we have tools for code collaboration, for running automated UI tests from your own IDEs, so from a shift left perspective, for running automated UI tests, across your web, desktop, mobile, and then running those on real devices and cloud as well through an integration with cross-browser testing. Hip test is a tool where we're going to be working with behavior-driven development. It's one of the newest additions to the portfolio of tools we have, and that fits in kind of into the middle of the development testing side of things between the UI and API layer. QA Complete for test management, and then Alert Site, as I mentioned, for monitoring your applications and APIs. If you look at the API layer here, then that we're going to be talking mainly about today. So Swagger Hub is a commercial offering, so it sits on top of the Swagger framework of tools, and it allows your teams to collaborate on API design. Using Swagger Hub, you can drive consistency across the API designs within your organization. Have your hosted documentation available to consumers, and of course we integrate then with various different API gateways and your source control tools so that Swagger Hub can fit into your workflows. Once your API is defined, then you can start building your tests in SoapUI by importing your Swagger definition. And from there, you can create your load and performance tests using Load UI, where we're going to actually reuse the tests that our QA team have already developed. So we're not starting from scratch. We're not going to have knowledge of heavy scripting, and we get to reuse work that's already done, which kind of makes sense if we're working especially in a fast-paced, agile environment. We need to get this stuff working as fast as possible, automate as much of it as possible, and have everything available when we need it. So speaking of availability, this is where Service V would come into it as well. So although in Swagger Hub we can we can use auto mocking from a definition perspective to generate static mocks from our API definition if we want to take it to the next level and build actual virtual services that are stateful. Then we can use Service V for that. So Service V basically is going to allow us to remove dependencies on services that maybe we don't have full access to. They're controlled by another team. They're third-party APIs that incur rating charges when we send requests. Or alternatively, we've only designed our API in Swagger and that API is not being developed yet. We haven't actually built out the business logic behind it. So with Service V, we can take an API definition and create a dynamic mock from that definition. And this means that we have a service, or at least a dynamic mock of the actual service available now, as opposed to maybe weeks or months down the line when development is completed. Okay, so from a development, testing, and operations perspective, we can develop in Swagger Hub. We can run our tests in SOAP UI and Load UI. We can remove dependencies by creating mocks of third-party or other services using Service V. And then from an operations perspective, we can monitor our web and API performance once it's in a production environment and get alerted immediately should there be any issues or unavailability. Okay, so just to show you some of the brands that we're working with across the various sectors and various industries. And you can see that pretty much with about 6.5 million users worldwide of our tools, we are pretty much everywhere and anywhere. Okay, so into the actual tool itself. So if you have been using SOAP UI, you're not familiar with Ready API, we're on version 2.4. We have a quarterly release cycle, and version 2.5 is actually coming out really quickly, or really soon. So when I talk about what's new in 2.4, there's going to be a lot more stuff available in 2.5 once it is released in the next couple of weeks. Main improvements from between 2.4 and 2.3 would be usability and UI. So things like the addition of search boxes across the tools and in the project level, which allows us to search for particular test steps, cases, test suites, resources, and any other items of your, within your API and your projects. We have done a little bit of work with REST Discovery. So with REST Discovery, where we can record HTTP traffic and generate our interface and operations that way. Again, more UI changes. And from a reporting perspective, so we have actually updated all our reports. So if you're doing automation, we have the reports that we would recommend for automation. And this is clear to see when you go in to create your actual report. A couple of things, if you're novice users, there is a Ready API will display hints to basically tell you or guide you through making your tests powerful and flexible. Using data in your requests, using scripts and setting up and changing environments. So as a new user, you'll see this when you actually open the tool for the first time. With regard to Swagger Hub, so we did mention it earlier on, there's improved Swagger Hub support. So if you have a private Swagger Hub account with your API definitions and documentations, you can now import private open API definitions directly from your Swagger Hub account. Okay, with regard to SOAP UI itself, there is a new shiny Jenkins plugin. So SmartBear now has a SOAP UI plugin for Jenkins, and this will just make the job of setting up and running your functional tests from Jenkins easier. If you've been doing this already, you're probably using a command line with the plugin. A lot of that manual work is going to be taken out of it for you. A couple of other things. We now support JSON Web Tokens during OAuth 2 authorization. And we have a couple of new panels to display any JDBC transaction data. right? So this just makes everything look a little bit better and cleaner if we're querying a database and pulling back information that we need to feed into our requests, for example. Okay, from a load testing perspective, we have basically generated more user-friendly, readable report metrics. So for example, our printable reports now contain average 90th, 95th percentile, 98th percentile metrics by default. Okay, and from a service V perspective, we improved the JMS virtual services. So we can virtualize SOAP REST, and now we can do JMS. Well, we could always do JMS, but we can do it a little bit easier now. Okay, so I'm just going to talk very high level over the tools just to kind of pad out a little bit about what we talked about so far. Again, the quarterly release cycle. So if you do have Ready API, I'd always recommend upgrading to the latest version. Of course, if you have it, you can just go help and check for updates. And if there's a new update available, you can download that. If there are any issues or any bugs that you need fixes, there's also a nightly build repository available for you to upgrade your own personal system if you're waiting for an enhancement or a bug fix or something like that. So what we're looking at here is a dashboard, and this is a high-level overview of how our tests are running. So this is on an individual basis, and will give me a kind of bird's eye view of my different tests. I can generate reports, update my team management fairly quickly. From a projects perspective, then this is where we're going to create our new projects using various different API definitions by recording traffic, or simply pointing to a REST URL, for example. Once we create our project, then we're going to have our project, our interface, our operations, and our sample requests. Then we can start stringing together our requests in our functional tests, validating using point and click assertions, and then use that setup for regression testing or incorporate those tests as part of our CI pipelines. So if you look at our project here, you might notice there's a little C on this folder here and this one here, but not on the rest of them. So composite projects are designed for team testing, and the C stands for composite. Previously, in older versions of SOAP UI, there was only the ability to save your projects as a single XML file. However, now there is the ability to save your projects in composite format. So basically, a directory structure is built out with all your functional performance tests, any dynamic mocks you've created. And then you can sync this with your source control tool like you would with your normal code or whatever UI testing and other aspects. There is a plugin for Git available. You don't have to use Git, but if you're using Ready API, this integration will save and retrieve your composite projects in Git or GitHub automatically. So for example, if I'm working with my colleague on a particular project and I log in the morning, I can pull the latest tests that he may have been working on yesterday into my workspace and continue on, and then check in those files afterwards to keep everything in sync in that single source of truth. There's a number of different plugins from a Jira integration. If you're using Postman, you can import your Postman collections. We do support MQTT as well, and a number of other. Let me see which is of interest here. Would possibly be the Swagger Hub import export. So I mentioned that earlier about connecting to your private Swagger Hub and importing your API definitions directly from there. From a best practices at the project level, I would normally set up my environments and I'd set up my authorization. So if you look at this SmartBear library folder here, we have environments, right? So for example, I might want to set up my UAT pre-production staging environments because I need to run various different tests against those environments. If I can configure this and set it up at the beginning, it's going to make my life a lot easier down the line. Now, from a manual perspective, in SOAP UI, I can simply switch out of my different environments using the drop down up here. So let's just select something like my SmartBear library. Oh, and I know why that's happening, because we have changed to our default environment. So here's my SmartBear library here, and you can see that we can quickly swap out of our different environments, run our tests against those different environments, generate reports. From the command line, we can basically just reference a -E argument, which stands for environment, to reference the environment that we want to automate our tests against. If you look at a test case I have here, from an automation perspective with any of my tests, I can simply right click and launch Test Runner. And Test Runner UI here will generate the command line for me. So if I wanted to run a particular test suite in a test case against a certain environment by generating JUnit style reports, maybe I'm using Jenkins, for example, for CI, and I want to take those reports that are generated, parse them into Jenkins so I can see, number one, if my tests have passed or failed, but secondly, if they failed, I may want to get a stack trace of all that information. Okay, and you can see the option here to get command line, which is going to generate the command line for me. Another little time saver. One thing I didn't mention was with regard to, and it's not going to work because I don't have a virtual service running. But let's go with this one here. Okay, so just one thing as well to mention, you're hopefully aware of it, in the outline view of my response window here. So here's my request, my response, here's my endpoint. I can right click in that outline view and add assertions for the existence, for specific content. And this will, we will generate the actual JSON path or XPath expression for you. So we're removing that manual side of things from the equation. Okay, so just to kind of summarize where we're at so far, we are going to create our projects using a Swagger definition or a waddle or a WSDL, or pointing to a URL. Within the projects then, we will see our project, our interface, our operations, and any sample requests that we can simply select and start testing straight away. Configuration of environments we touched on. I would set this up at the beginning, as well as any authorization profiles, and maybe even any JDBC connections to databases if I want to pull in data from specific databases. Okay, so from a SOAP UI perspective, I've created my test here, and I want to create a load test from it. So I can right click on any test case and create a load test. Okay, so you right click, and then I can just create a load test. Okay, so when it comes to load and performance testing, the team is not starting from scratch. We're not starting coding and building up our load tests in JMeter because we don't have to. We have our functional tests that exist already. So why not take work that's already done and spin up those tests with hundreds or thousands of simultaneous virtual users to get an understanding if our APIs are going to be able to handle the number of requests and the kind of traffic that we're expecting. Okay, so that's one way of doing it. If I actually go into Load UI and select the project itself, I can use this new icon up here. This is going to allow me to create pre-configured load tests that our product team have put together. So for example, maybe I want to run a baseline, check the server performance under expected load, and this may and will create a baseline for later load tests. Then maybe we want to stress test it. Let's find out at what stage when we ramp up our virtual users interacting with this service, does the server come unresponsive, or does the average response time SLAs fall below, fall below our SLA, should I say. So there's various different tests and templates here. Of course, you can configure this all manually yourself, but if you look at a baseline, for example, or actually a stress test. Now what I can do is I can choose the functional tests that have already been created. I can set up my virtual users. I can monitor my servers and databases. I'm going to actually skip this for now. And then we can set up our assertions, or we can use the pre-configured assertions. So within a couple of clicks, we've taken a functional test, spun it up in a load test. We now have 100 virtual users that are going to be interacting with this test. And we can see, we can get our metrics then once that test has been run. From a server monitoring perspective, just to mention that there is the ability to monitor your operating systems, database servers, things like JVM and that. And this is going to allow you to understand where the bottlenecks are, where the issues are in your actual system. Because maybe we are running a load test, we're updating resources in the database. Without monitoring that database, it's going to be a little bit hard for us to figure out at what level of traffic does that database become unresponsive, or the time to update resources in this database, fall outside the SLAs that we may have. So with Load UI, you can access the performance counter data of those target machines and pull that back into your reports, as well as having your API statistics and metrics available, which is going to help you to figure out a little bit easier where those issues or bottlenecks are. Very quickly, from a distribution perspective, we can distribute our load tests across agents. Those agents could be found in my network, so we can install agents in various points in our network and use those machines to generate the traffic for us. Or if we want to test from outside our firewall, I can simply use Amazon EC2, where we have a Load UI agent image, and I can spin that up in various different geographies to test performance from those specific regions. So let me see if this is gonna run. Let me just run something here for 10 seconds. So you can see very quickly the way we just had a SOAP test pre-configured, fired up, and we run a ramp up test. Now you can see we can get any failures we may have here. We can examine our stats, generate our reports, or review the actual errors itself. There's also the ability to log specific requests and responses based on certain conditions. Okay, so for example, maybe I want to log all the certain HTTP status code responses, or maybe I want to log the requests and responses that are over a certain limit. Okay, so there's various different options to log that information to console or file. Just going to pop open a quick report. So this is basically our printable, shareable PDF report. And you can see on the screen here where we have our test properties and our scenario details. So this is a ramp up where we're going from 10 to 100 virtual users. And we're going to generate these nice colorful pie charts to show things like our failure ratio, assertion failures, average, shortest, longest response times. Okay, and then you can see here, as we mentioned earlier, our average 90th, 95th, 98th percentile. Okay. As with everything in all the tools within the Ready API platform, we can automate. So this load test, again, we can launch Load UI test runner, generate our command line, and automate these load tests as part of our CI pipeline. Okay, so what can we do with Service V? As we mentioned earlier, we can create new dynamic virtual APIs using definitions or by recording traffic. Okay, so for example, as we mentioned in Swagger, I have my API defined, but I won't have access to that actual API for a couple of weeks. So what I can do is I can take an API definition, and let me actually show you a really quick example. Okay, so I'm just going to drag this into the window for a second. You can see this is my Swagger pet store. This is the documentation that's auto-generated by Swagger. So for example, get pet by ID allows me to send a particular ID of a pet, execute it, and get back a static response here that's been built into my API definition. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we are going to, in Service V, create a new virtual API from my Swagger definition. I can import that JSON file, and before you know it, we have a mock service available that we can now configure any dispatch strategies we like. So for example, we have a get pet by ID, as we looked in our documentation. and I have sample responses that have been carried across, okay? So what I can actually do here is I can control how those responses are dispatched, and we can turn an API definition into a dynamic mock within a couple of clicks. Then, of course, I can take that virtual service and deploy it onto Vert server and allow access to all the clients, users, systems that need to interact with it. Okay, so just I suppose to summarize kind of what we talked about in this very short webinar, is the ability to take your Swagger definitions as well as working with SOAP services to create your interface and operations, build your end-to-end tests in SOAP UI, reuse that work to spin up your load and performance tests to ensure that your API is ready for a production environment. In order to remove dependencies, we can use Service V to virtualize third-party services or other APIs that are out of your control that you need 100% access to. So with that, we're going to end today because we've just hit a half an hour already. Thanks for joining the session today, and I hope that you've learned something new, and definitely follow up with Sean if yourself or any of your specific teams would like a deep dive into any of the tools. We'll be more than happy to do that for you.